Perfect, perfect. All righty. Well, the session is being recorded. So good morning, greetings, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We have a wonderful webinar today, PR in the time of COVID-19. I am Jamia Kinsey Singleton. I have the honor of serving as the president of the New Jersey chapter of the Public Relations Society of America, better known as PRSA. PRSA New Jersey is the local New Jersey affiliate of our actually worldwide organization that is the leading organization for PR professionals. Our members live and work throughout the state of New Jersey, whether it's northern, central, or southern New Jersey, we're all throughout the state, and we represent a variety of businesses and organizations. Being a part of PRSA New Jersey has a lot to offer. There are lots of perks. Not only do you get a chance to get some professional development opportunities, but you get access to resources, and it's a wonderful way to connect with other PR professionals throughout our area. We also have PRSSA chapters at local colleges and universities, so that's our student organization of PRSA. And so for those professionals or students who may be on today's webinar who are interested in learning more about our chapter, and of course becoming a member and joining our team, you can visit prsanewjersey.org. Again, that's prsanj.org. So for today's webinar, again, we are talking about PR in the time of COVID-19. As we all know, over 18 months ago, COVID-19 hit. And when the pandemic hit, not only impacted our personal lives, whether it was, our health and safety, obviously, working remotely, just, learning about what social distancing meant and quarantining and staying in place. It also impacted the PR industry. COVID became the news that everyone was talking about in every media outlet, whether it was on TV, in the paper, on social media, everything was about COVID. And still, obviously we're still in the thick of it. And so we're still seeing that COVID is ruling the news even today, 18 months later. For PR professionals, obviously it became a little bit challenging because if we were trying to pitch non-COVID related stories, that became a challenge. For those who might be working in communications in the healthcare industry, obviously they had a lot to share during that time in terms of health and safety of people across the country. And then also budgets were cut, staffs were reduced. There was just a lot going on. And obviously the pandemic impacted us professionally as PR professionals as well. And so, but while there have been many challenges, the pandemic also provided some opportunities for PR professionals to do what we do best, to help communicate, to navigate how to communicate through this crisis. And so again, while there have been challenges, there have also been opportunities. And as we know that it has impacted our industry and will have long impacting effects on our industry as well. And so we want to know, how has it impacted our industry from a perspective with COVID? And then also, what are some of those long lasting effects of the pandemic? And that's what we're here to discuss today or learn about today. And so today we have the honor of having Kathryn Lancioni from Seton Hall University. And we also have Dr. Pooja Arora from HCL, and the Shiv Nadar Foundation, India, who will address those questions. They will share insights from their global research study of more than 100 PR practitioners from 14 countries across the globe on how our industry has changed, recommendations, and skills that are required for the future. Before I turn it over to Stephanie Reed, who is one of our PRSA New Jersey board members and the chair of our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, to formally introduce today's speakers and tell us a little bit more about today's session, I want to thank Stephanie, Linda Coles, and also the rest of our DIB committee for putting today's event on. Thank you all so much for all the work that you do to make sure that diversity, inclusion, and belonging are always top of mind for our chapter and for those throughout the state and those who have decided to join us today. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, today's session is being recorded. So for those who are on who would like further information or want to be able to see the replay of this, we will be sending that via email, as well as to those who may have registered and were not able to attend. We want to make sure that this wonderful webinar is shared with as many people as possible. So thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you for our outstanding speakers. And I'm going to now turn it over to Stephanie Reed.
Thank you so much, Jamia. I can't tell you the great anticipation that I have for today's session. I'm looking forward to hearing Kathryn and Dr. Arora, as well as a couple of additional guests that we've invited to today's session to speak very specifically about their global perspectives as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kathryn and Dr. Arora to begin your presentation.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. Pardon me, we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy work schedules to learn about an industry that you all work in and hopefully love like I do, but to understand how globally our industry was affected by the pandemic and continues to be affected by the pandemic. Dr. Arora and I, who collaborated on this work, came up with this idea, I guess at the height of the pandemic. We were both working on something else together and one day discussed, gosh, we wonder how this whole thing is going to affect our industry, both in India and in the United States and around the world. So over the course of several months, we reached out through our networks and spoke with well over 100 people about the effect of the pandemic on them in their respective PR industries. And you'll see the results of that in this presentation. I'm going to go to the next slide and open it up and talk about what we're going to cover. Then Dr. Pooja Arora is going to go into some of the data, and then we're going to toggle back and forth between the slides. So what you see here is our agenda for the discussion today. The first is we're going to overview the research and how we did it. We'll then talk about the demographics. We're then going to discuss some of the changes that happened during the pandemic, some PR strategies and tactics that were affected and how, the future of the PR industry, and then our recommendations for businesses that either need to sort of revamp themselves as a result of the pandemic, whose businesses really suffered, and for students who are looking to come into the PR industry. What are the metrics for success? How have things changed? And what is it that we as more senior PR professionals expect of them? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Pooja, who's going to walk us through the research.
Thank you, Kathryn. And first of all, thank you, Stephanie and Jamia, for giving Kathryn and I an opportunity to share our findings. I hope that it proves to be insightful for the attendees. So the data that you're seeing and you will be seeing was actually gathered during the second wave of the pandemic. And that was the time when it was extremely difficult to ask people to do any extra thing. Just filling up our survey was an additional task for them. So COVID-19 caused a lot of disruption across sectors, across industries, and PR was one field that came to the forefront to help businesses communicate better, to connect with their stakeholders. So through this session, we aim to highlight consolidated insights of PR practitioners from around the globe on what changes they felt during the pandemic, how they changed their PR approach during the pandemic, and what are their recommendations for the future, like Kathryn just mentioned. Could you just change the slide, Kathryn? Okay. So if you see the data here, the data was gathered from March to May 2021. Like I said, the peak of second wave. This is not related to any textbook. We're not going to give you any framework or any model. We're going to present inputs gathered from 112 PR professionals who were in the age group of 25 to 60 years based out of 16 different countries. These included USA, India, like you can see, UK, Philippines, Italy, South Africa, Botswana, Ghana, Serbia, Malaysia, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Hungary, Singapore, and New Zealand. And the survey was conducted randomly, and we reached out to PR professionals through social media posts. Based on that, we had 47% male respondents and 53% female respondents. Next slide, please, Kathryn. Right. So the focus shifted to COVID-related news only. Interestingly, before the pandemic, I remember organizations getting ignored by journalists because they only wanted to talk about corporate social responsibility. However, this changed completely post the pandemic. Business stories were not a priority anymore. Business organizations also realized that it would be important if they could talk about how they are conscious towards the society. right? And then the preference accordingly shifted from print to online editions because so many print publications were shut down. And the shift suddenly reflected on the interest of the organizations because now all organizations wanted to be heard. They still wanted to tell their story. And from print to online, suddenly they wanted their stories on online, social media, and the game suddenly changed completely. Even the volume of virtual meetings, tours, conferences, they increased. This saved a lot of time, cost of organizations that were there. And so like earlier, if a press conference had to be arranged, one had to take care of a lot of things logistically. They had to create a beautifully designed invite, book a venue, most of the time in a 5-star hotel, take care of the food, post the conference, take care of a lot of printouts, of press releases, brochures, etc. But the virtual meetings just removed all these factors and organizations just came to the point that was around their announcement. And of course, the connection with the journalist could be established because as you know, when there is a face-to-face meeting, you can get to know a person in a much, much better way. So relationships with the journalists got hampered. And this was a feedback that we received from most of the respondents. However, some of the respondents also mentioned that they implemented a 15-minute virtual coffee meeting with a journalist to continue with these relationship building factors and meetings. Because of the virtual platform, the working hours also became longer. Actually, there was no fixed time earlier as well, but then the concept of 9-to-5 job completely got blurred during the pandemic. And the other aspect around the PR tool, so press release, which was earlier considered to be one of the key PR tools, has now been taken over by social media. So although it is necessary because it just keeps the communication document ready for a company, social media has taken over in terms of the visibility factor, the kind of reach it can provide to an organization. And obviously, besides that, there are new platforms like podcasts, Instagram, TikTok, all of that. Even Netflix is a great platform to promote tourism and hospitality. There are these series like, I'm not sure if you've seen, somebody like Feed Phil, which talks about different cuisines that one can find in different countries. Then there is a series called The World's Amazing Rental Places, which talks about these cheapest yet some prettiest places to stay. So, I mean, these platforms have actually helped organization come back to their normal times. So what I'm trying to say is that while these platforms keep evolving, it is also an opportunity for PR professionals to upgrade their skills. So the ones who feel that they need to upgrade their skills in terms of the social media platform, social media know-how, this is the time to actually do it. Kathryn, do you want to add anything or you want to move to the next slide?
Let's go on to the next slide. So I think as Pooja was just saying, our research spanned the globe and our research spanned everyone from generalists to very specific PR practitioners. And one of the big questions, or one of the things we really wanted to find out was, how has your job changed? Is it harder or easier, compared to COVID? And, you see the results sort of here. The only industry where practitioners reported no change was in the technology sector. In terms of making their jobs harder, folks who represent companies in aviation, beauty and wellness, e-commerce, finance, sports, logistics, real estate, education, it's all here, art, pharma, they all said their job had been a lot harder. Easier, said it was celebrities, politicians, education, telecom and technology. And those where it made it easier and harder were those that were corporate communications in-house people, generalists, and folks that were involved with philanthropy. I think for philanthropy, we wanted to point this one out specifically. It was mixed. The results in India were very different from here. I know lots of nonprofits that I work with or counsel as part of my work at Seton Hall really had a tough time because money was tight for a lot of people. And so a lot of people reduced their giving, which as a result reduced the ability of a lot of nonprofits to even operate. There were some that sort of had an angel come in and give them a large donation. But for the most part, a lot of nonprofits really suffered during the pandemic and continue to suffer. So for them right now, many of them are trying to rebuild their image and try to level set and figure out who they want to be in this almost post-pandemic world. And what you've seen is, what's interesting is that the fluctuations between some of the more traditional B2B sectors, such as aviation, finance, real estate, education, health, technology, and some of more the business to consumer, which might be the celebrity PR and the technology PR, was easier. So I think the fluctuations in this are fascinating across the board. Pooja, did you want to add on this one at all?
Yeah, just the graph that is there. So 61% of respondents of the survey felt that the changes were harder as compared to pre-COVID time. 12% felt that it was easier, and 23% felt that it was a mix of both. Then 4% also felt that there was no change at all. So you've already covered the different sectors. We can move on.
Yeah, I just want to say, I know one thing in talking to colleagues was, the one part of what we do that was so much harder was the relationship building. And Pooja touched on this a bit earlier when she was talking about how people were doing virtual coffees and stuff like that. But in talking to colleagues literally from all over the world about this one point, it made it harder from a logistical standpoint and from a motivational standpoint. And I think that was throughout the pandemic, especially when things first started back in March of 2020. Everyone thought this was just going to be a 2-week thing or a 4-week thing or a 6-week thing. And then it just became a thing. And so, everything had to be recalibrated. Everything had to be rethought. The initial reaction from many of the folks that I work with and many of my peers was everything just got canceled. But then what happened was things became reimagined. And Pooja and I were able to participate in such an event. It was a conference put on by a university in India called DME, which is out of New Delhi. And they actually, over this past summer, did a 10-day conference with participants and speakers from all over the world, and it was all virtual. And that conference really has become sort of a hallmark, an example by which many others are modeling. And we can talk more about the future of our industry, but I just wanted to point out that, initially everyone was just kind of in shock as to what had happened. And there was a big fear that the relationships that many of us had built up over decades were going to fall away because of this. But when people reimagined and rethought about, well, how can we tweak what we do? How can we create these sustaining and develop even more relationships? People realized the beauty of Zoom, the beauty of virtual conference calls. And then as things got better, meeting people in outside venues. So it's been a really interesting experience for all of us over the past, 18, now going on 20 months.
Right.
Pooja?
Yeah, sure. So out of the 112 respondents, now this particular slide talks about how, they responded to the pandemic. What was the effect of the pandemic across the globe on these PR practitioners? So 61% of PR professionals, like we just saw in the previous slide, felt that the changes brought on by the pandemic were harder. And these were from the various sectors that Kathryn already spoke about. While respondents from countries like Europe and Asia, including Belgium, Germany, Italy, Malaysia, and UK, noted that pandemic made things more difficult. So only 27% of respondents from US shared the similar sentiments. And a small number of participants, if you see the chart, felt that the pandemic made their job easier. And these were mainly belonging to telecommunication sector or the government or education sector. In the US, only 9% of these participants said that the impact of the pandemic made their job easier. Rest were all falling in the category of either harder or easier. Only 4% of the PR professionals who didn't feel any change worked in the technology sector from India, like Kathryn already pointed out. Yes, Kathryn, over to you.
Okay, sorry about that. I changed a little term, really. Okay, so what we wanted to do was we really wanted to highlight some of the actual thoughts, because quotes and thoughts and sentiment really do bring the data to life. And so we've highlighted a couple of the responses, and I should say everyone that's being quoted here agreed to have their name shared. So Ann Tenenbrook, who's a PR professional from the United States, has said, you know, the pandemic really made her think out of the box a lot more than before. In the pre-pandemic era, we had a set formula for what work and how we followed the time without too many changes. But the pandemic changed the game and took everybody out of their comfort zone, forcing us to innovate. In a profession like PR, relationships are very important. In-person meetings and events are key to the relationship process with stakeholders, because there's so much opportunity for that in-person conversation. And as she said, that's made it a lot harder to have those informal conversations over a Zoom meeting where things are more agenda driven. And, you know, that was one of the takeaways that was surprising, because I heard that from a bunch of people, was, you know, when you're sitting in a restaurant having a conversation with someone face to face, you get those just sidebar conversations. You know, someone goes up to go to the bathroom and the executive leaves and you just talk to the reporter one-on-one about something. Or, you know, you're all leaving and walking to catch a cab outside and you share one more thought. You don't get to do that on a Zoom call, right? It's all agenda driven, as Ann noted here. And the Zoom meetings definitely has made relationship building more effective, because we all dial in and dial out at a certain time. But we've lost that kind of soft part of what we do. And I know for myself, it's the soft sidebar conversation that led for me to the development of some of my best contacts at the Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and stuff like that. So I thought her insights on this were really fascinating. We also wanted to highlight somebody from Malaysia. And she said, you know, she's being honest here. She can't say whether it's made her life easier or harder. It's, as she notes here, changed the way she works and the way she interacts with our clients. Strategies had to be changed. Creative elements such as design are now super important. And dealing with the media has also changed, as they're more demanding than they were before. And I think this is another observation that we've had both in the United States and around the globe, as there was already consolidation going on globally with media outlets. But in some cases, especially in poorer regions of the world, that's continued. Most things have gone digital. Most people are reading their news online, and both Gen Z and millennials look to non-traditional outlets for their news. You know, I know a lot of my students, they'll look at, you know, what does their influencer consider news, but if their YouTube influencer or their Instagram influencer, some of them get their news from Instagram. They don't look at traditional outlets like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC. So it's made it harder for us, because we have the traditional routes and outlets that we would have gone to. But because everything in the pandemic changed everything, made us all go so much more digital, it's really caused a lot of us to have to rethink, okay, is that strategy that we were going to implement right? Or is there a better way of doing it? Okay, Pooja?
Right. So the old way of PR was like this huge airplane, which had a defined runway laid down by a strategy person. And, you know, the ride was always comfortable unless the weather was unfavorable. However, the new way of PR is like flying a fighter plane, where the runway is not really defined and the pilot needs to be skilled, confident, fearless till the last minute, as he or she needs to monitor their plane. And they are always in the mode of stress. And this is exactly what the new PR person or the field looks like. So here are some of the permanent alterations that are here to stay in the field of public relations. To begin with, I would say that, you know, we humans adapt to new environment very quickly. For example, just to maintain business continuity, everyone quickly adapted to the virtual events, virtual press conferences, webinars, and I've already spoken about how nice and convenient they've been logistically. And because of this, face-to-face meetings reduced. Social media will continue to be an important PR tool, and PR professionals will include it as part of their PR strategies. So earlier, social media was considered as a value add and not necessarily a preferred mode always. but now it is the core of the PR strategy. Crisis management will obviously now take a key role while creating a PR strategy, and people will take it more seriously. Earlier, it was that whenever there is a crisis, only then the organization or the PR person would think about it or the technique to counter it. But now it will be part of the overall strategy. And of course, the digital exchange of the information. So around 6 years back, I remember I used to share hard copy of the press releases with the journalists while doing media rounds or while meeting them during relationship building meetings. Now the journalists are only interested in digital copies. So this was just one example. Obviously, there are more. Last but not the least, senior PR professionals who we reached out to through this survey said that going forward, they would like to hire emerging PR professionals or people or students who have a know-how of social media world. Even better if they themselves are an influencer. I think it's important for youngsters to leverage these new age platforms and also become an influencer. Next slide, please, Kathryn.
Okay, so again, just to share more thoughts on this, on how PR has been affected. So from India, someone wrote, it has influenced and will continue to influence the work and relationships in organizations as they evolve. Pooja, can you read this one? Because my bar is, I can't, because I'm controlling the thing. I can't see the whole quote.
Sure.
Why don't you go ahead?
It has influenced and will continue to influence the way work and relationships in organizations evolve. Working together is gradually giving way to individualistic tendencies of people relying more on electronic gadgets to deliver work than on people. In turn, this makes the income divide more visible as the poor and lower level workers who cannot afford the gadgets, energy, and data will continue to be left behind. It actually talks about the poor and the rich class divide that has happened because of the digital divide. Yeah.
And I think that's something that is really important to realize here, is in countries where there's more economic support for PR professionals and for PR agencies, they suffered, but they didn't suffer as much as we did as individuals in emerging third world economies. And that's when you think about PR, when you step back and think about it globally, at first blush, it's all done the same way, we think. But what the pandemic has showed us, when our research showed us, is that in areas of the world where the economy isn't as strong, we took a bigger hit. Our industry took a bigger hit. And I think that's just something important to think about, important to realize. We're not all able to do our jobs the same way because we don't all have the same access to technology. And I think that's just incredibly important. Okay, so strategies and tactics as we're still in COVID, and then we'll talk about going forward. So as we've talked about before, and I think Jamia mentioned this in the beginning of the webinar, was that, stories that we've all heard a lot of COVID stories. We've all, sadly seen the numbers of people that have perished and the number of people that continue to perish, which is tragic beyond belief. And so now companies are still connecting stories to COVID, but they're not necessarily talking about the negative. They're trying to focus on the positive. But we're seeing that, some connection to COVID is still an important thing that people want to understand. Another big thing is the storytelling. That's always been an incredibly important aspect of what we do. I mean, I think if you ask any sort of mid to senior level PR person, when they're asked what they do, we say we tell stories. And it's not like we're reading somebody's Cinderella, but we're, telling stories about a company, bringing to life for journalists and for ultimately consumers, the nuances of what a company sells or what it does. And these days, that storytelling is happening so much on social media and through visual content. Another big thing is we have a 360-degree approach. It's not just, it's not just social, it's not just print, it's not just broadcast. It's the amalgamation of all of those. It's using the juxtaposition and the sort of the fortitude of everything to co-leverage. So how do you use traditional media to work with social media, to work with emerging media? And again, the ability to do this varies by the part of the region of the world that you're in. Pooja's in India, they don't have TikTok. And if any of you here in the United States, you understand or you know that in the US, TikTok is an incredibly popular way for musical artists to release records. If any of you have any millennials or Gen Z in your life like I do, you'll be listening to Top 20 radio and my kids will be like, oh, that was a TikTok. And it may be a song that's done by an established artist, say Taylor Swift, for example. But what's happening is even the most successful artists are now leveraging this new medium to drop their music. Well, they can't do that in India. So the question is, in this kind of bifurcated industry that we're in, how can we use the tools around us to all be successful in what we're doing? Relationship building is important, will continue to be so. There's thought leadership continues to be important. Authored articles always have been, always will be. Webinars, increasingly important. And podcasting is increasingly important. I'm sure some of you are on Clubhouse. I know I am. I know my students were like, you need to be on Clubhouse, and I am. But there's also a whole ton of other podcast opportunities out there right now. And it's a great time for people to be able to create content and post it virtually free to so many social media platforms. So both on an individual and corporate level. And then the other thing that we're seeing, another tactic that's become incredibly important, is doing virtual launches. So you can still do in-person ones where it makes sense, but you can also support that in another way through virtual. And I think to me, that's a huge change that's come with COVID. Before, we tended to be more, we would just follow one strategy. But COVID has sort of underscored the importance of the duality and the importance of doing stuff in the digital world as well as in the physical world. And to me, that's one of the greatest takeaways from the research that we've done. For businesses that have struggled during this period, and again, we've seen it in the nonprofit sector, we've seen it in traditional retail. If anybody has walked through New York City in the past couple of months, it's starting to get better. But there was a lot of discussion about all of the retailers that are in Midtown that were on the walk to Penn Station. Commuters weren't coming into the city. Those businesses that relied on that commuter traffic really suffered and really struggled. Many of them shuttered, a few have reopened. So for companies like that, or companies that just kind of have taken COVID to pause and redefine, here are some strategies for how to revitalize your brand. Leverage social media and new age media to stay relevant. The cost to go on social media is so little, and that's because it's so supported by advertisers. So leveraging the strength of the platforms, the ability to impact from the platforms, the ability to bifurcate from the platforms, and go after niches that you think might understand and want your brand. It's a great way to go after it. Keep workers remote. We don't all have to be back in the office. I've heard of so many offices in the New York metro area closing their headquarters and letting people work remotely, or keeping a tenth of what they had and just having people go in on sort of a rotating basis once or twice a week. Look at low cost media that sort of goes to the digital age stuff. How can you leverage relationships? How can you leverage platforms? How can you cross leverage? What are ways that you can re-envision what you've done and repurpose them for what you would like to do? And then, of course, you want to keep communicating and staying top of mind with your consumer. Skills. What do we think our future PR pros need? There are a couple of them. Storytelling. This is something that we talked about before. This is something we'll talk about now, and it's something that everybody talks about all the time. The sort of sizzle in what we do as PR professionals is we bring to life the brands that we represent. We help people understand the why. We help people understand the need. And we don't do that through written text, although sometimes we do, but we usually do it through talking and through the visual. That's a skill that we've all had. That's a skill that we're all going to need going forward, and it's not going to be one that goes away. Social media is incredibly important, as we've said. Social media is no longer done in a silo. It's an integrated part of any PR campaign. And in many ways, it's the driver of a PR campaign. Why? The cost is low. It's easy to measure. Measurement and evaluation has become a huge part of what we do. Some of us, like myself, have been around in this industry when measurement was just kind of a thing that we talked about, but now it's something that we all do and we all understand, and we do it on a daily basis for our clients. Agility and multitasking. I always said when I worked in an agency, it was like multi-level multitasking, working on 3 to 5 clients or managing a group or running a division. You learn how to multitask and you understand the need to prioritize. That's something that's part of what we do. It's something at the fulcrum of what we do, and that's also not going to go away. And then the other 4, and this is Pooja's favorite thing to talk about, so I'm going to let her go into this more, but it's the 4 C's of PR: creativity, communication, critical thinking, collaboration. That's really how this all works. Most of us work in teams. Most of us work with clients who have teams internally. And it's that collaboration and that critical thinking and that just out of the box creativity. I always say to people, tell me the most absurd thing that you're thinking of right now. Just tell it to me. And then let's all share those ideas. And usually it's one of those crazy thoughts that actually becomes the strategy that we go with. And Pooja, I know you want to talk more about this one.
Sure. So I think it's important for everyone to understand that creativity, communication, how you communicate, how you think critically about a problem that is presented in terms of a new campaign idea, how crazy you can go, how thoughtful you can be in all directions. I think that is what the idea of the 4 C's is: the art of collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. Yeah. Kathryn, go ahead.
Yep. And so for one more quote from John in the United States, what does the future of PR look like post the pandemic? The future looks bright, since PR practitioners have proved how vital they are to an organization's operations. We will see a push for organizations to grow in-house capabilities rather than solely rely on a firm. And I think, again, from my perspective and seeing what I see and talking to people that I talk to, PR has become more strategic, and Pooja and I are going to talk about this in a little bit, but assets crisis communication. I've been doing research for a book that I did last year. It was fascinating to trace the evolution of our industry. And, when you think about crises that have happened, the biggest one prior to COVID was 9/11. And it was that crisis that that whole event that really underscored the importance of crisis communication. I mean, yes, you can go back to the Tylenol scandal of the 1980s. You can go back to Watergate, right? There's always a crisis, but ones that cut across so many industries. 9/11 was really emblematic of that. And so that event really showed companies the importance of crisis planning. And that event really did trigger companies around the world, especially in the United States, to have comprehensive crisis plans. Fast forward to COVID, and what we've all understood is that crisis shouldn't just be a plan that's in a notebook that's on the shelf. It should be part of your daily operations. Because at this point, crises happen more often than not. These days, crisis is just another way of responding to part of a PR strategy. So it shouldn't be something that's separate. It's something that should be included in a PR practitioner's daily crisis routine, daily PR routine. So as far as the future of PR, let me let Pooja take the lead on this one.
Sure. So overall, 72% of the participants, if you see in the pie chart, were positive. They felt positive about the future of the PR industry, while 17% felt the other way. 11% thought that they were not really sure about the future of the pandemic. But the majority of the respondents viewed digital as the new age strategy and something that all PR practitioners, all organizations should take seriously. Even pre-COVID times, organizations never really took the role of a PR person important. They never considered it to be a significant strategical role. But what happened later on is that after the pandemic hit us, that the role of PR was taken seriously. And the thing is that the best way of communicating, all the PR strategists realized that it's not just the PR approach that will work. It would actually be the 360-degree approach wherein they could incorporate both social media, paid media, earned media, all of it together. Because like Kathryn mentioned earlier, all the stories were around COVID. So obviously the earned media aspect for many sectors reduced. So they had to focus on a 360-degree approach. But the rule of the thumb is that if you apply the rule of the thumb, you're living in pre-COVID times. So you have to put in creativity in this new age, and best PR strategies involve mind and heart. You have to invest in new learning because it's an evolving field. And one example that I'd like to say is that PR strategy comes from 3 A's. One is awareness, second is adaptation, the third is agility. If you imagine that you're sitting in a plane, no matter how nervous you are of heights or flying, you have to trust the pilot. And any senior pilot, if you've ever interacted with him or her, they will say that the pilot needs to have awareness of the weather, how is the weather changing, if he's aware of the patterns that are changing, how is the direction needs to be moved, all of that. And good PR strategists need to be aware of what is happening around them, not only in their sector, but in other sectors as well. So no matter, if something important is happening, something significant is happening in any other sector that you don't work for, no matter what you do, I promise that it'll come to your doorstep someday or the other. And a very good example of that would be through digitization. And examples like Amazon, Snapdeal, all these, Netflix, these are all examples of how people who were earlier ignorant to these brands, they suddenly adopted to it. Amazon is a great example because they started their initiatives with PR. So PR strategy, if you ask me, it's like an ice hockey game. The ball is called the puck, and the puck can come from any sides. It is moving all the time. That is how the agility needs to happen. Thank you. And Kathryn, over to you for your perspective.
Yeah, no, I think, the important takeaway, as Pooja was saying, is that what COVID has done is it's not only underscored the importance of PR, but it means that we now have a seat at the table. I always tell my students that at this point in my career, I would never take a job for an organization where I didn't report into the CEO. Because unless we have the voice, the ability to talk to and get direction from the the CEO of a company, we're not strategic. So I think that COVID has underscored the importance of what we do and how we do it. It's made it strategic, not just to a company's achievement of its business, of its communication goals, but as part of its overall business objectives. And that's incredibly important. It's also underscored the ability or the need for PR professionals to be great communicators. This is not an industry for somebody who can't write or who can't pitch or who can't think on the fly. It's not an industry for somebody who says, I have to get back to you. It's an industry for people that can think quickly on their feet and suggest ideas to clients. COVID underscored how quickly life can change and how quickly things can change. The brands and companies that survived are the ones that were able to quickly adapt. They did not become shocked or paralyzed by what happened. They thought about who they were and how they could hopefully help or be additive to what was going on in society. Brands transformed overnight. Commercials were transformed overnight. You saw companies like Uber Eats, right, talk about how they've redefined their business, how they're trying to help healthcare workers. You saw companies like Amazon change their advertising strategies. You saw companies like American Express Travel change how they were positioning themselves, because everybody knew that it was no longer business as usual. It was business in a pandemic, and it was a pandemic that no one had ever experienced before. So I think for us now, being sort of 18 months, 20 months into this whole thing, we as an organization, we as an industry have gotten through a lot. We've learned a lot. We've seen what's worked and what hasn't. And now in terms of working with clients, it's time to, I'm not going to say recalibrate, but take a pause and see, okay, what did we do before the pandemic? What did we do during the pandemic? And how do we want to combine those techniques and those strategies on a go forward basis to develop and build our brand in a post-pandemic world? And again, we really thank you guys for taking the time to go through the data today. And now we'd like to have two global PR professionals join us to share their comments on how the pandemic affected them specifically. Ramya, do you want to go first?
Okay, all right. Hi, Kathryn. Hi, Pooja. Thanks so much for that report. I know I contributed to it because I was one of the people who participated in the survey, but I didn't realize these were the findings of the survey. Well, you guys have covered mostly everything, and I can try and contribute a little bit from my perspective. Now, I represent an organization which is in multiple businesses, and we're also pretty multinational. While I'm based in Singapore, I had fairly diverse global communications team that's spread out in about 15 different countries. And so we have a combination of both internal in-house resources, as well as I work with external agencies with different skill sets as well. And also because my company is involved in multiple businesses, I could see the shift. So there are a couple of things that I saw happening. The most obvious was this major intersection between PR and marketing. Now, even pre-pandemic, this had been happening for some time because the nature of public relations itself has been changing because storytelling has been evolving. And ultimately, whether it's PR or marketing, both functions at their core are really about telling great stories, whether it's about a product, a brand, or a person. And what I realized was happening, especially during the pandemic, is a lot of the budgets were being shifted. And this is something that I experienced. So instead of spending a lot of money on external events and doing travel and doing the usual media related activities that are considered traditional, a lot of the budget that my team was working with was shifting towards content production. So digital content, video content, all kinds of other interesting visual content, because the storytelling landscape itself was changing. And because our marketing departments in some ways had to tailor all of their messaging towards COVID, there was a lot of reliance on PR to keep the business as usual stories ongoing. So my organization is involved in a couple of different businesses. So travel was one which obviously got hit. We own a bunch of hotels in different parts of the world, and most of the hotels were pretty much shut down. But we still had to find a way to keep going in terms of what we were communicating online about these hotels. So we had to find interesting ways to communicate how the hotels were surviving COVID, what were the sanitization protocols, and highlighting staff who we called COVID warriors, things like that. And then on the other hand, I'm also very fortunate to be part of an organization that has a very active social impact community. And so our corporate foundation was involved in doing COVID relief activities in about 30 different countries. So we had these incredible opportunities to tell these COVID relief stories through social media, through video content production. It was really interesting because what I realized is we weren't just talking to journalists anymore. PR was no longer just about media and media relations. We had this entire landscape of people. The stakeholder game had changed completely because we were also communicating with our customers who were wanting to understand, what are you guys doing as an organization while the world is being ravaged by a pandemic? What are some key business changes you're making? So suddenly the journalists weren't the most important things in our lives. Suddenly it was the customers as well, and not just the customers in some countries. So I have a team that's sitting in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast in Western Africa. And there it's the government authorities who are wondering, hey, who's this organization and why are they doing so much COVID relief stuff? We've never really heard about them before. And so then we realized that we had to tailor a lot of our messaging towards policymakers to explain to them who we were, what we were doing. So really, PR wasn't PR anymore. In fact, it was a combination of marketing, social media, television broadcasting. I don't know, we've been doing so many different things. And I think now this has become the new normal. We've been doing it for now about 18 months. A lot of my budget has now shifted towards digital advertising because we're creating all of this great content, but how do you make sure you get it in front of the right people? And the only way to do that, we're realizing, is digital advertising, whether it's Facebook ads or Instagram ads or YouTube advertising, and now Google advertising. it's my budget hasn't shrunk, unlike a lot of other people. Again, touch wood, I've been quite fortunate. But what's happening is it's shifting. The way how I used to spend money pre-pandemic has just changed. So now it's just digital, digital, digital. Everything is very digital. So these are some of the key changes that I have noticed based on my experiences in different countries.
Yeah, and it's great because that really, I mean, in many ways, that very much underscores what we found with the data. It really does. And I should say that, you know, to me, what you do and where you sit in the world, as we've discussed before, I find absolutely fascinating because Singapore is kind of in the middle of so much. So Ramya, thank you for taking the time to be on and share your perspective. And Parinita, do you want to go next?
Parinita, you're on mute.
Yes, I realized that. Thank you, Pooja. So, hi everyone. I actually work in a hotel, like Ramya touched upon. We were the worst hit. Tourism in India was badly affected, and in terms of not only travel, but in terms of employee safety, that was hit too. I think hospitality is as such known for emotions and connections, especially in Asia. And we were one of the topmost countries, India, as such, where culture, diversity, and connections and experience and hospitality means so much. But with the pandemic, everything became touchless. It became contactless. And India has never seen a hospitality industry like this. We were shocked. And at that time, PR for us was not only social media or journalists or anything. It also meant communicating with each other because it became so difficult. Out of 10 of us, I think 5 of my team members were affected. And it went on and on. And it was very, very hard for us. To begin with, we started implementing policies within the hotel staff. We call them heartists, which means big heart and artists. So we started calling each other heartists, and every heartist was a PR person in itself. They were the brand ambassador for the hotel. We started communicating in terms of my team, marketing team started communicating with journalists where we were not just talking about stories. We'll just do a well-being check. We were sending them immunity hampers, which could just have fresh fruits and vegetables that they could wash and eat. We were doing little things that could help us survive. We came up with a lot of revenue model at that time because for hotels, since everything was shut for close to 6 months in India, we really had to survive for basics like salaries also. It was a very, very tough time. But what we realized out of this is that change is actually the only thing which is constant. We had to come up with different things, revenue earning models, well-being, immunity checks, and everything. So yes, Ramya rightly mentioned, it wasn't about journalists anymore. It was about social media. It was a lot about visuals. It was a lot about connecting with each other. Even though it was virtual, it was hard in the beginning, especially as hoteliers. It's very, very hard because we've known is how to be on ground, how to look after our guests. But eventually we realized everything falls in place. We started reconnecting in terms of new experiences, refreshing F&B models. Let's say QR codes is something that we hadn't seen before, but we came up with restaurant QR codes, digital menus, everything that you would touch and feel, it all became contactless. And I'm very happy to share with you right now, currently hotels in India are doing very, very well. A lot of people are doing revenge traveling. We're calling it revenge because they haven't been able to travel at all. And, India, most of the borders are shut, but within India, there's so much you could do. So yes, touch wood, we're doing very well and we're still surviving and thriving. That is something that we've learned and understood over the last 1.5 years, that everything will fall in place eventually and we will adapt to changes. So yes, I have contributed to the survey as well. I've been very, very positive in terms of the things that I have also personally learned from the whole pandemic situation. This is something that was not taught to me in college or by any mentor, since it was the first time for all of us. But it was fun, I would say. And I'm sure it's fun for all of you too. Thank you.
All I can say is I need a revenge trip. I love that. I'm going to have to start using that in my discussion. Stephanie, did you want to, I know we have a couple of questions. Do you want to ping one or two of the questions?
Absolutely. So one of the questions is, how can new entrants into the PR industry build the types of connections that seasoned PR professionals were able to build pre-COVID, right? We talked a bit about relationship building and how important and fundamental it is to what PR professionals do. And it seems that these tactics would be most helpful to established professionals, but I'm curious to hear your perspective on how this applies to new entrants as well.
Let me start with this one. You just have to start, right? That sounds like such a cliche, but you do. And this is like, I always say the reason I got into teaching PR was because I saw so many bad PR people in the field. It's so true. So my goal as a professor is to make better PR people. My advice is just start. You don't start by like annoying someone on social media, but you start off by following them on social media and reading their content, and then sending them an email, not a DM, but an email on why you enjoyed an article that they read and some insights that you shared. You have to always think, if you were on the receipt, how would you like to be treated? And reporters love to hear that people are reading their stories and people are learning from their stories. So one tip, what I would give is be strategic, go after people that you truly have an interest in, that you're truly going to read their content, and contact them after you've read a couple of their articles and you share some of the wisdom that you learned from those articles. Right? Who else wants to respond?
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, Kathryn. I think when I was doing my research, the one thing that the journalist said that the PR entrants, they don't do their homework properly. They don't really look back and find out, what the stories are done by the journalists. What is it that the other sectors are working on? Because when you're working in a PR agency, you're supposed to also understand the different sectors and not just really focus on one sector. So I think awareness is the key. You need to be aware and you need to be agile, and you need to understand that, when you are doing one task, you can't just be fixated on doing one thing at a time. You need to understand other areas of work as well.
Well, I'd like to just get in one more question. We are running a little bit short on time, but are there specific techniques that PR professionals from the most significantly affected sectors like hospitality, art, and sports leverage to manage this crisis?
Pranita,
Sure.
do you want to comment on that one since you're in the hospitality industry?
Yeah.
Yes, so that's a great question. And I think I've faced that myself in the last 1.5 years. It is very important to connect. That's what I always tell people. And connection does not mean writing an email, writing an SMS and checking how are you. That it doesn't make sense. For hospitality professionals, you really have to be imaginative, go out of the box. We face this. So like I was mentioning earlier, we came out with something called immunity hampers, which just had a small little dose of, cucumber juice, freshly made from the hotel, since hotels were anyway shut. We were making use of little things where we were going out to our Indian National Army. We were going to the frontline workers and distributing 1,000 meals free of cost. These were the little touches that we did, and automatically journalists covered us. We didn't even have to go to them and ask them for any publicity. It was all over our social media. And if you look up the kind of initiatives that hotel with my competition brands, they've done, the kind of empathetic emotions they've shown towards the whole situation is commendable. I would say just go out of the box. Don't think of it as a situation for commercial purposes. Do it with all your heart and passion. Think of it as if this is your own family, little family that's stuck in this pandemic. We're all in it together. That's how we were building our brand.
Ramya, do you want to add, since you also do the hotel thing with your clients?
Well, actually, I think you've all covered it. Pranita pretty much covered everything that I wanted to say. So one of the I guess new things that I tried to do for my group of companies, because we have nearly 2,000 employees, is we actually started an old-fashioned newsletter. We started a COVID-19 newsletter, and it was just. It wasn't initially, it was about, letting people know how to survive the pandemic. And we realized it was getting a little bit depressing, and then we needed to shift everything. So we started doing these great COVID warrior stories. And then we started coming up with, new recipes and, hope, messages of hope, messages of joy, pictures of hotels where our hotel staff were doing fun things in the hotel. What do they do when there are no guests there? And they hadn't been any guests for a long time. So, little TikTok videos. So we created this newsletter, and then we were just sending it out to everybody. So it creates connections, like Pranita was talking about. So that was really helpful, because especially hotel staff, and my company also owns a sports team, and these guys were just training and didn't have anywhere to go and play. So these things became important. It was all about what was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah,
Great,
I think I just add one part. So I think COVID-19.
So Kathryn and Dr. Early want to thank you for. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I must have lost my connection for a moment.
No worries. I think we're at time, aren't we, with the presentation?
Yeah.
That's right. I want to thank you both for sharing this fascinating research. Your findings have been incredible. I am assured that there are 72% of people who feel pretty positive future of PR following this pandemic. I want to thank Ramya and Parinita for joining us for this session as well. Kathryn and Dr. Pooja, do you have anything that you'd like to say in closing before we wrap up?
I just want to thank everyone for joining. Please find both of us on LinkedIn. We're both there. We would love to link in. If there are any questions that didn't get answered, please send us a message through LinkedIn and we'll be happy to respond. Pooja, did you want to add?
Yes, thank you so much for having us here. It was a great platform. Thank you, Stephanie and Jemia. Thank you, Parinita and Ramya, for taking out time to share your insights. They were really valuable. And thank you to all the respondents of the survey. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank everyone for staying up late, because I know in most areas, most of you are not in New York Metro. So we really appreciate you, especially Ramya, since it's midnight where you are. We appreciate it.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending. I am entering a link in the chat for you to complete a survey regarding today's event. You also will receive it in a follow-up email if you don't have an opportunity to do it right now. I appreciate you showing up today. Thanks so much for this opportunity to have your research shared with a wonderful audience, and we'll be sure to share the link to this recording as well as additional resources as a follow-up. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.